Hello, everyone. My name is Bobby Marlab. I'm the co-founder of Mental Walks along with Adina Jacobs. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to this iconic conversation series on building inclusive workplaces. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of First Nations peoples and pay our deepest respects to their elders emerging past and present. We've had an enormous response to registrations to tonight's webinar, and more than 200 questions have been pre-submitted. And it speaks to the strength and the importance of this topic of building inclusive workplaces. And I couldn't be more delighted to have the following people joining us today to share their experiences in their workplaces and what they are doing to build a more inclusive Australia. I'm delighted to welcome Angelina Einot, who's a D&I expert and the Director of Positive Impact Coaching, who's going to spend about 10 minutes taking us through the diversity and inclusion landscape in Australia. Then it will be my pleasure to welcome Stephen Cain, the CEO of Coles, Erica Berchtold, the CEO of The Iconic, and Christine Parker, Group Executive HR of Westpac. And I'm also delighted that Tina Halliburton, the General Manager of Mental Walks, will be contributing to this conversation about her own personal experiences of inclusion and exclusion as someone who was born in the Philippines and came to Australia as a young child. So without much ado, the way today will work is that after Angelina's presentation, we'll speak to Erica, Stephen and Christine. And if we have time for questions at the end, we'll be delighted to delve into that. Although I think there's a lot to cover, and please put your questions in chat, but I cannot promise that we're going to get to them tonight. So Angelina, with great pleasure, over to you.
Thanks so much, Bobby. Hi, everyone. Let me just pull up my presentation. Here we go. Okay. So what I'm going to cover over the next 10 minutes, and also with some help from Tina when she shares some of her lived experience, is just a little bit of a snapshot of the inclusion landscape in Australia at the moment, to also do a few definitions first off, and also start with some high-level tips on inclusion. Okay, so definitions first up. Diversity. So you often hear people talk about diversity and inclusion. I know we'll have a broad range of people on who have, some with lots and lots of knowledge and some with less. So bear with me if this is something that you're right across anyway. But when we're talking about diversity, what we're talking about is the mix of people in your teams or in your organisations. And the Diversity Council of Australia puts that into two buckets, one being your social identity. So that's things like your age, your LGBTQI+ status, disability status, faith and religion, social class, cultural background, caring responsibilities, gender, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander background. And also another grouping called your professional identity. So that might be your education level, your profession, your organisational experience, or your work experience. So diversity is about the ways in which we identify and also the ways in which we differ. And that will be clearly very different in different teams and different organisations. So what's inclusion? The Diversity Council of Australia talks about inclusion. They have this lovely 4-word model, which is respected, connected, progressing, and contributing. So inclusion is how we get this mix to work. So inclusion happens when a diversity of people are feeling respected, connected, like they're able to progress and able to contribute within teams and within organisations. And of course, that's very feeling and being included is very individual. And this is, Bobby alluded to this topic being such a hot one and such an interesting one, and also in some ways can be quite confusing because it is very individualised and specific. So how inclusive is Australia? even this question was quite a difficult one to really to really find some good data on. So this is the data that I've decided to use for tonight. So it's from a 2018 Ipsos survey. So 27 countries and over 20,000 people. And as you can see, in this particular survey, it shows that Australia ranks out of those 27 countries as 5th. So the green essentially means very inclusive, and I should really tell you what the question or the questions in this survey were about. So essentially what they would do is, for people who are surveyed in Australia, they would say, is a real Australian ... and then they'd ask various questions. And if they're in Canada, is a real Canadian ... So one of the things that we know is that there's a very strongly held belief that if you are in the armed forces or a veteran, that you are a real Australian. Now, I guess the other thing that we know in looking at results of something like this is that it's actually complicated. So we know that if you even just have a look at the results here, we know that this particular piece of research didn't actually ask any questions about attitudes towards First Nations people in Australia. We know that in terms of religion, there was less inclusion if your religion happened to be Islam. Also, if you have a criminal background, which you can see across here, there's, you're definitely not considered a real Australian according to responses to this survey. I thought this was interesting. If you have extreme political views, only 37% of respondents said you could still be a real Australian. Why I found this interesting was that in the States and South Africa, the number's higher. So you can still be a real American and have extreme political views. But one of the bits of detail that's not really shown in here is that 35% of Australians surveyed were either not sure or they did not believe that LGBTQI plus people were real Australians. So it's very difficult to actually look and ask a question like this, how inclusive is Australia? Because it is extremely complex and extremely nuanced. It is, however, well known, and this is the space that is my particular area of expertise, which is gender. It is very well known that Australia still has quite some way to go when it comes to closing the gender gap broadly across areas. So this is the gold standard in measurement of gender gaps, and the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report. This is the 2022 results for Australia that came out earlier this year. And Australia's 43rd out of 146 nations. So just to give you some context, our friends and neighbours across the ditch in New Zealand are at number 4. Before that, of course, is 3 Scandinavian countries. The UK is at number 22, US is 27th, and Canada 25th. So probably the kinds of nations that Australia would often like to compare and contrast itself with, we're not really sitting with when it comes to gender equality. I also just happened to hear in the news last week as I was travelling in the car that we are also below most of these nations when it comes to ageism also. So if we have a look into some of the detail around this, we can see that there are definitely big areas of improvement that are needed. Now, I'm going to call Tina in a moment, but first of all, this is a campaign from the Human Rights Commission in Australia, and this is specifically around racism. So I think it's interesting to note some of the questions that we ask, and also, so yes, in relation to racism, but also you could ask some similar questions in relation to a whole other range of areas of diversity. So for instance, do we need to, do we feel that we need to be concerned about abuse on social media if we put up a specific opinion? And that may be based on race, it may be based on our religion, it may be based on our gender. Do we see people that look like us, either on television or in public life, in Parliament House? Do we see people who look like us? I read some figures that said that we have an underrepresentation of non-European Australians within the current government also, even though we have a stronger reputation, for example, representation when it comes to gender. So some of the things we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about inclusion are, some of the questions that we're asking about exclusion. It kind of helps us to look at both sides. So Tina, shall I pull these slides down to bring you into the conversation here? Hello. Actually, what I shall do is just, there we go. Okay. So Tina, I'd be really interested if you would mind, and thank you for being so generous to suggest that you would do this, if you would mind sharing just a little bit about some of the areas where you feel like you've differed to the norm in workplaces you've been in, and some of your own personal experiences of exclusion.
So exclusion started for me really early, Angelina. It started actually really when I arrived in Australia, and I was almost one, and my Filipino mother and Australian stepdad realised at that age that my full name was going to get me into trouble. It was hard to pronounce, it was going to get teased, all of those things. So they decided to change my name, and I fought it for a while even when I was quite young, because I realised the name that I would have as an adult wouldn't be the name that was on my birth certificate. So I fought it quite a bit. Then I went to primary school and high school, and I was so grateful for my parents to change my name, because I really, as you said at the start, did look very different to everyone. And a lot of times it was just me and my face looking like me, let alone with the name that I'd had. So I was really grateful to them, and they really wanted me to have the best opportunities. And so after a really tough time in school, high school, and it was a small country town as well, so that also exacerbated it all. I was so excited to start work in my working life. And when early in my career, I thought it was actually easier, but on reflection, it just wasn't as bad as high school. It just wasn't as in your face. So although it was better on reflection, it actually wasn't. So things like group interviews. So I would be early on in your career, when you've got a big group interview and there's a whole lot of you in a room, again, I would look around and it would be someone that just looked like me. You would get to the interview room and you'd see the names of the rooms or the pictures that were in the rooms as well. And you'd realize again how different you were. And things, even though they seem small at the time, it does accumulate. Social days where come and support your AFL football team. In my growing up, that was not part of my culture. It's not something that's part of my DNA at all. So in those little ways, I felt excluded, but at the time I didn't really realize it until reflection. Where it really became quite apparent to me is when I started to move up in my roles and make it to the decision-making table. And that was in my role of digital transformation. So that is where it really became apparent, because I realized 1 year, 2 years into a role, the same voices, the same decisions, and unfortunately, the same outcomes were happening every single time. So it was really tough in a digital transformation role to make that happen. And one of the best examples was really towards probably the end of one of my roles. There was a particular initiative that we wanted to put up as a digital and transformation team, and we knew it was a big one. So I had put the whole thing together, the cost, everything, put it all together, and excitingly got the invite to present it to executive. Now, if anyone knows, in big companies, it is not the meeting at executive that counts. It's actually the pre-work. You have to talk to everyone else in the room to make sure that they're also bought into what you're suggesting. And it was quite disheartening because I'd done about 10 pre-executive presentations and it wasn't being really received very well. So I thought, actually, this is not going to happen. And my manager and I, who had sat through all of these presentations, had said, we need to think of something else because we won't get the funding on this. The day before the executive meeting, it was decided that my manager would present. I wasn't happy about it, but they brought me into the executive meeting anyway. And he presented to all the same people my presentation in the same way. Fortunately for the strategy, it was accepted. Unfortunately for me, I sat there and thought, why? And so it was a bit of a change for me that I kind of realized, and looking around the room and looking at my manager, who was completely the opposite of me, why there wasn't a yes. So that was a really big kind of example for me. So when you talk about exclusion, for me, and I look back, it's tiring, it's lonely, and it's a confidence killer. And I know for Angelina and I, Angelina knows this because years ago, when I was going through this, Angelina was my mentor.
It's an interesting one too, Tina, because one of the things I was reflecting upon, so I'll just pop these slides back up, and you've shared some of these things, which are other common things that people say about how feeling excluded means. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is that idea of quiet quitting, which is being talked about, which is, I think, reflected in some of these things. But one of the other things I also remembered, Tina, was that when I met you, you were very senior, and there were many comments made about, she's a young senior person. So before I'd even met you, one of the things I knew about you was this word young. So it's interesting. And how about experiences of being included? Is there kind of a little snapshot of something that stands out for you?
Absolutely. The inclusion part was really the advice that I was given was to go and find my tribe. And whether it's bad or good, I still have a problem with that term because I think, why do you have to find your tribe? Why can't I just be included? But I understood that. And the tribe that I found that came together quite naturally, but we really had a big mandate. We were launching a product that was a completely different audience to this company had ever seen. So it was a big mandate to try things differently, do things differently, and we had the permission to do that. And within our tribe, we really decided it wasn't just going to be the group that sat at the table, but also the suppliers, the providers, the partners, everyone we brought in was going to be different. And I remember that example of feeling included is when we had our first brainstorming session with the external agencies and the partners, where it was all very different. And it felt so different. It felt like the ideas were different. People felt freer. Even the people who had voiced the same opinions and the same decisions were also stepping up and saying things that I'd never heard them say before. So that for me was really a big kind of great example of feeling included. And to this day, that is still one of the proudest things I've been part of. Now, when I look back in the last 5 years, that was kind of 5 years ago, and most of my work having been with mentor walks, I realise now, when I'm included, I don't have to spend those hours of trying to work out how do I say a new idea in my voice that gets accepted. What I actually am doing is doing my best work. So for me, inclusiveness means you're reaching your full potential, and I don't have to worry about how I'm perceived because it's about the work.
Yeah, there's an ease to it, and I'll just pull up the when we feel included and some of the responses that we get to that, which is, you know, absolutely in line with what you're saying. I feel valued and respected. I can be myself. I share more ideas. Work's more enjoyable. I didn't feel like I wanted to leave my job. I'm not afraid of sharing ideas.
Yeah, I think just one of the last things to leave on is just that whole notion around if we could all do that, if we could all feel that, and the time that's actually spent managing when people aren't included, all of those things. I think it just doesn't make sense that it's the right thing to do from a, not just the right thing, but from a business point of view, it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. Such, if we could all think about that, I think that's such a good point to leave on. Thank you so much for sharing that, Tina. I really appreciate that. Great.
Thank you.
Okay, this is a quote that I'm sure many of you have seen before, and I love Brené Brown. We're hardwired to connect with others. So she's talking about relationships here, but she talks about, I think about this in terms of inclusion. Without connection, without feeling included, we suffer. And not only do we suffer individually, we also suffer collectively. We suffer as groups. People don't get our best work. Organizations, teams aren't getting our best work. So let's just do a quick Australian workplace snapshot. So this is from DCA again, their most recent report. Less than 1 in 3 workers report having an inclusive leader. 57% report that their workplace is taking action on diversity. 25%, so a quarter, don't know if their workplace is taking action. So that's an interesting one to consider around communication. 1 in 5 workers, so 20%, did not support or oppose their workplace in taking D&I action. So that's an interesting one, and that's one that DCA talk about a lot, which is this kind of sleeper, the silent, the people who are kind of saying nothing, not engaging, and that's a group that need tapping. And of course, COVID has exacerbated things. So one of the things that's really clear is that we need to do more work organisationally around why inclusion is good for everyone. And certainly, you know, I have a master's in positive psychology, and my capstone thesis was on thriving women, thriving workplaces. So that was about the connection between gender equality and workplace thriving for all. So this is something that we need to think about across inclusion areas, that inclusion is good for everyone. So that's a key kind of tip for a place to start, which is, you know, remembering, and the figures are very easy to find, that companies that are more diverse have been shown to be more innovative. Companies that have more diverse boards and senior management achieve higher profits. Companies that are more ethnically diverse are 35% more likely to achieve above average financial returns. And diverse companies are 87% better at decision making. So some of the figures to think about, you can also, DCA has some fantastic media packs and things you can look at, and they're also available through a range of other organisations too. The other things to remember is, you know, non-inclusive managers are bad for business. So some pretty horrible stats there. 3% less likely to work extra hard. Okay, non-inclusive managers are also bad for employees. So 3.5% more likely for people to leave their current employer if they feel they have a non-inclusive manager, and 4 times more likely to report experiencing discrimination and or harassment at work if they feel that their manager is not inclusive. So here are the kind of numbers. This is from DCA on who is experiencing exclusion at work. Sadly and not surprisingly, the highest proportion of people feeling excluded in workplaces in Australia are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The second highest group are non-Christian religious people. So I'm not surprised, but it's an interesting one. Third, people with a disability. Fourth, LGBTQI+ people, younger workers, and then you can see the rest of the list here. So when we're talking about inclusion, exclusion and inclusion, we need to be thinking about a broader range of groupings. And here are just some of the kind of everyday ways that exclusion happens at work: not getting the same opportunities as others, having assumptions made about me, being ignored by people at work or being treated like it doesn't exist, being left out at social gatherings. So these are some of the ways that exclusion happens. And the kind of second last slide, the last slide I've got is a nice reference list for people, but the second last slide are just a few kind of top level tips for creating more inclusion. Now, one of the things that I would say is that awareness. So people say, how do we do this? How do we connect with open-mindedness and curiosity? And the starting point is being really aware of the makeup of our own teams and our own groups. So it is, there's work that needs doing. There's no one size fits all, which is why I think there'll be so many questions around how we do this. What the research shows is that awareness is really important, but it's not the end of the story, because sometimes when we become aware of something, oh, you know, that person comes from a different religious background to me, what we actually do is we clam up and we close up and we, you know, we don't want to ask questions and we don't talk. So awareness is a starting point, but then we also need to have acknowledgement, support, discussions, and let others, you know, tell us what inclusion looks like for them. We can rethink in our teams, you know, or think, first of all, think about who gets heard and how, and consider how we might put things in place that makes that different in meetings. We can make sure that it's safe for people to be who they are, rather than forcing conformity, saying professionalism looks like X, this particular box. And we can also advocate for and influence on inclusion. So one of the things I think is really important to do is to challenge when people say, you know, that kind of middle, that 20% that I talked about in one of the previous slides. When people say that's special treatment or it's reverse discrimination, we need to challenge some of that. And interestingly, you know, we have, even if you look at Australian Parliament at the moment, we have a case in point there where there's one side of politics that currently has 45% women in the House of Reps, which has had quotas in place over the last 10 years and targets, been very specific in achieving those. And now it has led to 45% representation of a gender balance. And another party that has, I think it's currently sitting at 13%. So 9 women out of 57 seats. So it's interesting to think about some of the, you know, the practical strategies that get put in place, but also some of the outcomes of those things as we go down the track. So these are now, all of these people actually have videos where they're speaking about things, TED Talks, podcasts, lots of, and I've tried to include a bit of a variety of perspectives in here as well for people to have a think about. So yes, I've included their books here, but go and do a bit of a Google search on some of these people. If they're not people you've come across before, have a look at some of their podcasts and videos and get curious.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelina. And on the follow-up email, we will include the further reading. Thank you for that. And Tina Halliburton, thank you very much for your contribution. I'd like to throw it open to the panel now, and starting with Erica. Could you just take us through how the Iconics workplace has changed during COVID, and particularly how that's affected diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, look, our workplace was always quite flexible to start with. So working from home wasn't an unusual sort of thing for our business, but we did have to dial up a lot of the tools that we had to make working from home on a more permanent basis, you know, easier to do. So whether that be Miro boards so that you could run virtual workshops, or other sort of technology tools to just allow us to be more effective in that, and particularly now in that hybrid sort of work environment where everybody isn't in the same place at the same time together. We've really had to look at, you know, rather than looking at how many hours or what days people are in the business, we said, let's have a look at the work that we're doing. So if it's a meeting where there's a lot of different functions and a lot of different areas of the business coming together, needing to make decisions, well, that's probably a meeting that will be more effective in person. But if you've got 100 emails to get through by yourself, you can do that from anywhere. You know, I don't want people coming in just to be seen, so to speak. I think also our business, we're quite a young, energetic business, and we had a lot of what I call social capital that had been banked before COVID. So we were able to pivot very quickly as a young sort of agile business into that hybrid and work from home model. But I did notice towards the end of COVID that social capital was starting to run dry, and we've really had to create a lot of connection moments, whether that be company all hands or conferences or just weekly drinks back in the office, just to get people to reconnect a little bit. One of the things that I was concerned about during COVID was particularly for the younger people in our business that, you know, for example, myself or my senior executive team weren't in official meetings with so much. How did they get exposure opportunities and that lead to promotion opportunities down the track when they're not, you know, having those casual sort of conversations or running into you in the corridor or able to drop into a meeting? Those team members were less likely to book an official meeting with me in my calendar while I was working from home, but they would probably come and have a chat to me if they saw me in the office. So, you know, there were things like that that we needed to really try and consider during that time and now as well.
Right, thank you. And Stephen, Cain, to you next. I mean, Coles played an extraordinary role during COVID. So how has the workplace changed for you?
Yeah, well, I'd sort of echo what everyone said so far. Everything resonated with me that everyone else has said. Where we've got to is a similar position where we want to, for the support centre team, which is about 4,000 people, we want to get to a hybrid situation, and we've more or less got to Tuesdays to Thursdays. If you're doing collaboration type work, then it's in the support centre, but Mondays and Fridays where you're reading lots of reports and lots of emails, and there's not much time for collaboration, a bit get on with things, then that seems to be working. I think in stores, it's a little bit different, where we've done a survey now on what hours everybody wants to work, and we're going through a re-rostering process to try and match as many rosters with as many hours that people actually want to work as possible. And so over time, I think we'll end up with hopefully most of the people in Coles working the hours that suit their individual needs.
Terrific, thank you. And Christine Parker, what's happening at Westpac?
Thanks, Bobby. Look, it's really interesting. Before the pandemic, we'd spent a lot of time talking about, you know, the future shape, size, future of work, and the capabilities, and really had a view, particularly given the impact of technology, data, preferences, etc., that, you know, that'd take us 3 to 5 years to get to where we needed to, and pretty much overnight we had to switch that. And we were much better prepared than we thought we would. A little bit like Stephen, we have a percentage of our workforce that were essential, so that was in our branch world, and we had to open and within the hours that we had, but we worked that a little differently. But the remainder of our workforce, circa 22,000 people, you know, we switched from working, you know, in the office or in, you know, out with customers to working from home overnight, and really getting people's skills and their digital kind of savviness up the curve. We had to do very quickly. The second thing that went with that, we did have people that have worked flexibly and part-time, but it was predominantly female and carers. All of a sudden that flipped. It was, you know, a large part of our workforce, male and female, and all different type of caring arrangements, and that started to change some of that dynamic about how work's looked at and shared. I think it also really for senior leaders, and particularly those who were a more traditional mindset of presenteeism equates to productivity and performance, to saying, well, actually, I don't have to be looking at Bobby sitting in front of me to see whether she's doing a great job. It's based on actually what the results are, and then how do I, you know, really upskill myself to be a better leader. So a lot of time and effort's gone into having the tools, as Erica said, but also upskilling leaders on how to lead in a different way. Roll forward to where we are today, we will never, other than where we've got branch world, we will never go back to permanent 5 days in the office, 9 to 5. It's very much hybrid, and hybrid determined by team. But we do have a philosophy that everyone needs to be in the office, with their teams 1 or 2 days a week or per fortnight, for the teams to determine when that is, because we think actually there's some work that is better done in teams, the collaboration, that coaching, mentoring. We had something like 7,000 people that were brought in through COVID that had never been in the building and met their colleagues face to face. So that real cultural component's been really important. So that for us is the stuff is continuing to evolve, but actually we've just run our most recent engagement survey, and people's satisfaction with that is the highest it's ever been.
Wow. And Christine, just to stay with you for a moment, then if we think about what an inclusive workplace means to you and your people at Westpac, how do you frame that?
Oh, look, for me personally, but Westpac, and it's core to our values, it's where everyone feels that they can belong, they can bring their whole authentic self to work, that they feel respected, and that goes through every tenet of how they actually work. And we're really an organisation that respects and celebrates diversity. And I really think that's important to create that sense of belonging and community. And organisations, you have to work hard at it, because, as we heard about earlier, diversity means many things to different people, and how you bring that together and you can bring your whole self to work and be part of that, but still be unique is incredibly important. But you can never take your foot off the throttle. I've got lots and lots of examples where you think you get there, and if you don't keep watching it, pushing it, putting hard wiring and soft wiring, you won't maintain it. Nirvana to me is the day we don't have to start to talk about it, but I think we're some ways away from that yet.
Yeah. And Stephen, what about for Coles? What does an inclusive workplace mean to you and your people? And also, what are some of the key initiatives that your company has in place around this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with what was said earlier around, achieving everybody's full potential. Diversity is not a body count. It's really about diversity of thought, and you don't get that diversity of thought unless people feel confident to say what's on their mind. And that's what we spend a lot of time thinking about, making sure that everyone's got training. It's not whether they think they're inclusive or not, but it's whether other people around them think that they are inclusive. And I guess the main things we focused on is making sure that for all of the diverse groups that are out there, is making sure there is a KPI, and that making sure that there is someone on my executive leadership team who has that KPI and who owns it and drives that in the business, as well as making sure that we have things like role models, and those role models can be internal. We've got a lot of great internal role models for women in the business. We work with Eddie Betts on Indigenous. We work with Dylan Olcott on the disability piece, and we've signed up to be a sponsor of World Pride for our 10,000 LGBTQI team members. So you sort of look at it as a whole rather than just as an individual thing, which is what signs of support are there for people in these diverse groups in your organisation.
And that's interesting that you're saying that you KPI your executives and with this, which I imagine is really important to making things happen. Erica, what about you? What's happening in the Iconic?
Yeah, I think our real focus is to allow people to, have that true self-expression, and as Christine said, bring their best, most authentic being to work. I see our job as creating a workplace to attract a very diverse cohort of people, to give them the environment in which they can flourish when they do their work, and then to ultimately retain a diverse workforce. Because as per all the information we just saw earlier on this call, a diverse workforce really does bring a much better set of results, and a much better workplace for everybody. So yeah, and I echo what Steve has said as well. We've just recently recruited our first diversity, inclusion, belonging business partner in our P&C space, so that we've got someone that can own this in our business, hold us to account, and then help us develop the KPIs and the frameworks in which we need to measure ourselves. We're only an 11-year-old business and quite a young business, so we have quite a way to go. I was actually excited about being on this panel tonight to hear what Christine and Stephen have got to say, because part of our journey is actually to listen to all of these other clever people that have paved the way before us, so that we can start to build our own plan moving forward.
That's a good segue back to Christine, because you talked about how you've got to relentlessly focus on this. And can you talk a little about what's worked and what hasn't?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Look, if I just go back a little bit, if I think when I came into the role 10 years ago, and we had a fabulous female CEO, Gail Kelly, and everyone just assumed because you had a female CEO, everything would flow, and all of a sudden you'd have, and I'm particularly talking about gender at this point, all this, women in leadership, and it would just become a matter of course. Well, it actually wasn't. And one of the first things that Gail did when she came into the role is said, well, and she challenged me. I'd just come into the organisation, and she said, how are we going to change this? So we had a dedicated, very senior executive underneath me driving it. It became part of it. It was on Gail's scoreboard that the board assessed her by. Every executive had their targets, and people do what you measure. And then once you set those targets, then we put what we called the hard wiring and soft wiring. So the right policies, processes, everything, looking at, pay, equity, panels for recruitment, etc., etc. But we also put the soft wiring, what we call soft wiring, which was the storytelling, recognition of great role models, setting up the right support groups of training and leadership. And that continues through today. We have exactly the same hard wiring and soft wiring, whether it's for Indigenous, like most other organisations, we have a RAP, but actually it's no use having a RAP if you don't have a plan and you have targets and a way to get there and measuring it. Same with cultural diversity. We have employee action groups, and it's really interesting. We got to our 50%. We've now got to our 40% on board with exactly the same with our executive. But you have to keep at it, because the moment you don't, it starts to slip back, not with intent. There's always reasons why. And so, people have to see that. The last thing I'd say, we've done a whole bunch of things, and I'm always happy to share, and we're constantly learning from others as well. But people also have to see people like them. And so one of the things for me was ensuring that we had senior women leaders. I've just hired a very senior Indigenous woman into a role. It's same with cultural diversity, same with LGBTQI+. So people have to see people like them. And I think you have to be really thoughtful about that. And the last thing I'd say, you've got to challenge when you see things that aren't right. So you've got to have courage. You've got to put stretch goals and objectives, but you've got to challenge when things aren't right and be bold and weed out people. And I'm really quite relentless on this, that actually don't live up to the values of the organisation.
Right. Stephen, over to you on this. Coles has just reached 40% of women in leadership roles, so congratulations on that. What for you has worked and what hasn't in terms of diversity inclusion initiatives?
Yeah, I think women has worked best so far. we're almost at the 40. We're a couple of decimal points away, but we expect to get there very soon. We've also just internally got to less than 1% on the pay gender gap as well, which or pay parity gap, which is something we've been working hard on. I think through COVID, it's been a little bit more challenging with our Indigenous groups, because there's been obviously issues with vaccinations. It does take longer to recruit and retain and cherish the Indigenous team members. And I think when an emergency strikes, it's all hands to the pump type thing. And so it's certainly, we're one of the, I think we've got 4,000 Indigenous team members, but we've got to do a better job of recruiting more and retaining more. And that'll be the focus for the business this year. I think the other thing that we saw is that with parental leave, it was very much focused on women, I think 95%, which may or may not be an accurate reflection of society. So one of the things we've done recently is to extend or double the time that the second carer can have as parental leave, alongside making sure that when women do eventually retire and take their super, that they are now going to get paid superannuation on government parental leave as well. So we're working hard on these things, but I'd say that our focus in the next 12 months is most around Indigenous, with a bit alongside the disabled group, which we're particularly focusing on how do we get more disabled into technology and those type of things, and that's where we're particularly working with Dylan Olcott and his team to solve the problem for everybody really, which is how do we get more people into technology, and in particular some of these more diverse groups.
Yeah, and Erica, as a younger business, and you mentioned that you've just hired the person to take carriage of this in your organisation. To date for you, what has worked and what hasn't?
So I guess there wouldn't be anything I'd say hasn't worked, but there's things I think we need to do a lot more. We have a saying, progress over perfection. So it's just making sure we keep the momentum going on the progress that we're doing. So last year we had our first Reflect wrap that was endorsed by Reconciliation Australia. We're about to get our next wrap, our Innovate wrap, endorsed by them. So what more can we do in that space? And I think what Christine was saying before about giving visible sort of role models, what can we do from an Indigenous perspective? So bringing some of those Indigenous brands to life and using Indigenous models in our business. But then there's other areas like adaptive wear. So we launched an adaptive wear edit in our business so that we could provide clothing for people that required that, but also to really bring that to life in a beautiful way, and to show people that we have a great assortment for them as well. We just launched a modest wear edit on our site, which I think it was that's one of my favorite edits, because it really is something that no one else has really done here in Australia before. I think the more we can give visible role models across the whole area of diversity, the better that is. And then on the parental leave sort of focus, I mean, I have 3 young children. I know how hard it's been over the years to keep my career momentum going during that sort of period. So I am quite focused on, and actually recently we've just promoted 3 women that are about to take maternity leave. And I just remember when I was first having children thinking, oh geez, do I even want to tell anyone that I even want to have a child? Because that might actually end my career aspirations. And now we're actually actively looking to how we can promote them as they're about to take maternity leave. So I think some really big symbolic things like that as well can help, I don't know, make it a bit more mainstream and make people feel more comfortable in this space.
And tell me, ideas like modest wear, where did they come from?
Well, we have some sister businesses overseas. So like one of our Southeast Asian businesses in the Malaysian market in particular has quite a great modest wear edit. And we had looked at what they were doing. and thought, oh, that's interesting. And then working with the local communities here and listening to our customers, we were getting the feedback that this is something that we would really like to see from you. And why don't you have, more product that's suitable for us? And I mean, look, there's a lot of education that comes with that. Like, we had a lot of product that was suitable for those customers, but the way we were photographing it was just not something that resonated with them and that actually made them think it was for them. And we had to just rethink the whole way we went to market on that product capsule and just say, no, actually, that's not what that customer wants. How do we rethink this entirely? So, so it was a bit of learning from sister brands and then a bit of listening to customers and bringing that to life.
Yeah, wonderful. Because I think everyone is learning from everyone else on this. And it leads to the last question I want to put to you as a group. And this is a question that's come through time and time again from the audience, which is for organisations who are nearer the beginning of their diversity and inclusion journeys, what are the key things you recommend they should do? And Christine, maybe let's start with you.
Thank you. I'm a strong believer of setting targets of what you want to achieve, whatever it's going to be, whether it's gender, cultural diversity, Indigenous. So set targets and then set plans that go within that, and then ensure that you have the right policies and processes that are in alignment with that. And then, and everyone can do this, find your, cultural leaders, your role models that are going to role model and recognise and celebrate that. Will be just a couple of suggestions.
Right, Stephen?
Yeah, I think exactly the same. I think you have to have people on your team who are passionate about driving this, whatever the diversity group is forward. And you have to have targets, and you have to be reviewing. It's like anything else in business, you have to be reviewing them regularly and see what's working, what's not. You need to go out to subject matter experts all the time, which is what's great about this call tonight, and listening to everybody else, because no one's got that. This is still very much pioneering, and there will always be groups who are not well represented or understood. But it's good to be able to be addressing some of the larger groups. But this is a job that will never end, like most jobs. You have to start somewhere. But certainly from our point of view, if we can be of help to anybody, then we're delighted to do so.
Thank you. And what about you, Erica? What would your key things you'd recommend be?
So as a young business, as I declared earlier, look, I do think the targets and the dedicated resources are really important. I think listening is really important, listening to colleagues and to other businesses, but listening to our team and our customers as well. And the final one I'd say is one that I'm trying to demonstrate or role model personally, which is to just be curious and be vulnerable. So even in prepping for this this panel tonight, our diversity, inclusion, belonging business partner Lynn had given me some information to read, and just to be vulnerable and open enough to say, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, and I really want to, and I'm sorry I'm so naive about all of these different terms or phrases. I really want to learn more. And yeah, I think that can be very helpful to upskill yourself, and also to allow other people to then be vulnerable and curious as well.
Thank you. And one of the things that also that's coming up is about what you found to be the biggest barriers to creating inclusive workplaces. Christine, you said you've got to keep on it. Like, what are some of those barriers that come up time and time again?
Oh, look, I one of the ones that I always used to get was, well, gosh, and this is specifically to women, but it'll be the same. There's just not candidates out there. We can't find them, or they're not at the level, or that whole argument, well, you're now being discriminatory towards men. So it's like unpacking each of those things, and I think to Erica's comment, and be open to have conversations and educate yourself, but educate, the people that you're working with. Like, I very rarely have conversations these days compared to 10 years ago around why we set targets in terms of women. And, it's much the same with those things. So being open, but calling it when you see it. You absolutely need to call it.
Right. And Stephen, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, no, it's the old adage, isn't it, that ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
To what Erica's been talking about, you have to educate people, and when you understand and learn, then you can act. But if you're not curious and you're not keen to understand or learn, then nothing will change. And we're spending a lot of time on sort of educating ourselves and others in what inclusivity means. And it's not what you like everything you do in life, it's not how you send things, it's how it's received by others. It's the most important thing. And I guess that's something we continue to learn. Even at the domestic level, I've got 3 kids in their 20s, and they've got very diverse partners, and I learn everything. I learn a lot every weekend when I'm with them about not only young people and what floats their boat, but also about their diverse partner groups as well. And I feel a lot better off for it, and a lot better informed, and able to make better decisions because of the people that are around me.
And just to finish off, I'm conscious of time here, but how will you all know that you're doing a good job on this? I know there are the obvious KPIs, but are there any other things that are what's going to let your organisations know that you are the inclusive and diverse workplaces that you want to be?
I'm happy to.
You go, Christine.
Oh, thank you. I think it's your attraction and retention. So your brand's incredibly important. Stephen spoke earlier about Indigenous employees. We've got the same challenge. So we've got some amazing individuals, and they are being targeted everywhere. So being able to attract and retain and being known as that in the organisation. But I also think listening to your employees, through whether that's focus groups, engagement surveys, all of that stuff's really important. When it's not resonating. Yeah.
Erica, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, through our engagement surveys, we ask a lot of questions about how people feel about our workplace. And then I think the attraction and retention, around this as well is important to measure.
Right. And Stephen?
Yeah, it's really tough, and you'll never be perfect. And, we employ 1% of all Australians. And as I keep saying to the board, whatever happens in Australia is likely to be happening in coal. So you've just got to accept that's the case when you've got so many team members. And so you've always got to be alert to the culture surveys. You've got to be alert to stop lines. You've got to be alert to emails that come in from kids' parents that work for you and everything else. And it will never be perfect in a large organization. All you can do is to try and live your values yourself and empower as many people in the organization to do the right thing, because there's no way I or the board or the executive leadership team can control 130, the behaviours of 130,000 people. You just have to sort of set the framework, and people are watching you all the time, and it's what you do, it's what you say, it's how you act, who you recruit. It's whether you get rid of people if they're not, adhering to the right behaviours and everything else. And you just hope that you get better every year. But it's a difficult task, and one of the most difficult in all of the management tasks, I think.
To each of you, Erica, Christine and Stephen, Tina and Angelina, thank you so much for joining us with this conversation tonight. It is such an important topic, and so important to the growth of Australia as a nation. If everyone feels they belong, the country is much better for it. So thank you all for joining us tonight and for the work you're doing in this area. And thank you to the Mental Walks team who have helped bring this conversation together tonight, and to the Iconic for supporting us in bringing the conversation series to you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Good night.